I'm Chip Hanna, and this is the For You Leaders podcast featuring Kirk Dando, where we truly go beyond the veneer. You'll experience the raw and the real of leadership. You'll see your feet not miles away from the top. Would you get a tattoo of your company's core values? Probably not, but you probably don't work at Kasasa.
Chip, you know what? I do not have a Kasasa tattoo, I will admit, but I've seen lots of them. And guess what? Kasasa will even pay for it.
Kirk, what would possess someone to get a tattoo of their company's core values?
Chip, that's a really great question. You know what? To understand the motivation, you really have to understand the culture of Kasasa. It is not only unique, it is truly inspiring and engaging. People that work there love it. However, if you're an outsider kind of hearing about some of the stories of the fables of it, you might even think it's cultish. And I assure you, I have been in the middle of it, and it is not cultish at all. It might be the reason why they are so successful. Today, we're going to talk again with Gabe Krajicek, the CEO of Kasasa. If you missed the last episode, I'm going to strongly encourage you to stop this and listen to the previous episode. In the last episode, you'll hear about how Kasasa is taking on Goliaths and winning. It is an incredible message for any entrepreneur. In today's episode, you'll hear why Gabe is so obsessed with culture and how he operationalizes their values into the culture. Listen in as Gabe talks about how he became focused on culture and its importance.
Well, the patch is our visual representation of our four values, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But really, to understand the story, you've got to go back to when I was in high school. And my father, who was at the time very, very sick with brain cancer, had just had to retire from his job. He was CEO of a relatively large company in the oil refinery services kind of industry. So, really kind of roughneck kind of group of people. And I had remembered my whole life as I was growing up, my dad was obsessed with culture. I mean, we'd at the dinner table talk about how you got to love your employees and how, there might be 10% wrong with them, but there's 90% right. Focus on the right. And I'd hear these lessons as I was growing up. And then I went to his retirement party when I was in high school, and I saw these guys that got up there with tears in their eyes saying how dad changed their life. I still remember Mac Bozart, who I'm still friends with today, giving a speech crying, saying, because of Mike, my dad, he was able to, leave the field where he was turning a wrench and work his way up to vice president. Now his daughter's going to college, and that just really impressed the heck out of me. And so when I was 22, I took over Dealer Skins, which was the first company that I ran. And I didn't really know at all what I was doing. The circumstances that allowed me to become the CEO of that company are just so lucky. It's ridiculous. There's no way I can take credit for it. It was like it fell in my lap. But I had a zoology degree from LSU. I'm 22 years old. I don't know anything about technology. I don't know anything about the car business. I don't know how to run a business. The only thing I knew that I could do, because I thought I had learned it from my dad and I'd seen the impact, was to try to build a great culture. And at Dealer Skins, I think that we did that. As we grew over the years, by the time that we sold the business, I was so proud of that culture. I mean, it just hummed. And I thought that I knew what I was doing. After we sold the business, I not too long after that moved over to Bankview. But I stayed in touch with the people at Dealer Skins, and I called up Vanessa Vandermeed, who now runs operations here at Kasasa, but she worked at Dealer Skins at the time. And I called her up and I said, tell me how the culture is doing. I just want to make sure it's still good. And she said, oh God, it's horrible. And I said, well, does anybody still talk about the Dealer Skins spirit of love? And she said, nobody would even know what those words mean. And I remember being genuinely crestfallen. This wasn't like darn, the culture's not what it used to be. This was, my dad had passed away by this time. This was my kind of homage to what he had taught me. I thought that I could create something great like he had created. And I realized that what I had created was so ephemeral that 6 months after I left the business, it had evaporated. And there's a line that I've associated with this experience from Jim Collins' Built to Last. Basically, that great leaders are clock makers, they're not time tellers. And what I realized I had done at Dealer Skins was be the time teller. I was the culture, and I mean that not at all egotistically. I mean it in a self-deprecating way, because I would go out there and do the rah-rah speeches. I would talk about culture. I'd ask everybody how they're doing. I would smooth over conflicts. But once I left, I just thought somebody else would go do those things, but I had done nothing to operationalize them. And clearly, no one went and did it, and the culture was gone as soon as it was there. And so I was determined not to let that happen at Bankview. And the first thing that I wanted to do was to make sure that the culture would never get associated with me again. And we created this symbol for our values called the patch. But the idea behind it was the patch is inanimate. It's not a person. It is the representation of the values. We have a $10,000 bronze sculpture of the patch in our lobby so that it's not going anywhere. It's something that people can point at and say, that's what we stand for. But it also, by using a symbol, I think taps into more of the emotional side of a person. If you think about, like, I remember one day I was driving to go see a bank in Iowa, and the meeting was going to be Saturday morning. This was late Friday night. The sun was setting over a cornfield, and there was this big old rustic barn, and it had a tattered American flag painted on it that's said, "In God We Trust." And I got chills it was just like something about the Americana-ness of it, the sun setting, the cornfield, the barn, the big American flag, and I got chills. And I started thinking, like, if that had just said freedom, it just wouldn't have been the same. There's something about seeing a symbol that you emotionally connect with. So part of the reason we wanted to create that patch was to have something that would be able to speak more to people's right brain, and just instantly when you see it, you don't have to think about it. The feeling that you associate with that. And since then, we didn't stop at just building the patch. We infuse the patch values into every aspect of how we evaluate employees, how we hire employees, how we onboard employees. I, as the CEO, am subjected to patch reviews by every single employee in the company so they can review my performance and tell me what I'm doing wrong. Every manager that gets reviewed by their employees on patch values has to present a presentation, kind of like an after-action review, to say, here's what you said I'm doing right, here's what you said I'm doing wrong, here's what I commit to do better over the next period. And then they have to bring that back to their employees the next 6 months and say, here's what I improved, I think, here's where I did worse, here's what I'm going to try to do again next time. So it really creates a sense of accountability, both from the top down and the bottom up, to live up to those values. And I'm relatively confident now that if I got hit by a truck, that this engine will keep running, which is really what I wanted to do. I wanted to create a culture that would sustain without me having to be here.
No, you absolutely have. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, if you get hit by a truck, that it would absolutely live on for sure. You talked about the accountability of just being able to, and it's just kind of putting it in front of people. It's what we were talking about earlier, is what you focus on is oftentimes what happens. I know people follow it now, but was there a time where you kind of had a process and it was pretty well lined out, but people just, they wouldn't do the follow through. They wouldn't check back in. They wouldn't do these things, or is it all
from the values point of view?
Yeah, from the values point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some. You can go look at Glassdoor and look up BankView, not Kasasa, and you can look at the dates on those reviews and figure out when our culture was in the trough. There were a few years of some really dark times. And when I think about what caused that to happen, I see two primary components. The first is that there were some people on the executive team that weren't living up to the values, but were high performers. And one of the biggest mistakes that I've ever made, and I regret it so much, was not being willing to, as you've put it, fire the brilliant jerk, the person who is a high performer but doesn't adhere to the values. And when you have, as we do at Kasasa, a value called love, and you're setting the bar pretty dang high. And one of the executives doesn't behave in a loving manner, and they feel like the CEO is looking the other way, it absolutely craters any credibility that you have in your value system. And I was, in my own defense, I was trying to give them a chance. I was trying to coach them, get them where they needed to be. I believe they were good people, and just, and I still believe that they are. They just weren't a culture fit. But there cannot be a nanometer of separation in the way that I, as an executive, act and what the values say I'm supposed to do. And when I fall short of those values, in a meeting every once in a while, I'll lose my temper. I don't know a CEO who doesn't. And if I felt that was inappropriate, I'll immediately say, I sincerely apologize. That was a violation of the patch value of love, or whatever value it was. I'll try to do better. Because you just can't let anybody believe that you're not constantly thinking about this stuff, because they're not going to think about it. The other thing that I think contributed to some of the cultural problems that we had was, as the company grew, I was operationally in over my head. And I'm not proud of that. It was just a reality. I was not an experienced enough manager to be able to keep up with the complexity of the business as it continued to grow. And just like so many other entrepreneurs that have a hard time taking their hand off the wheel, I was having a hard time giving other people the authority inside of the company to really help grow it, and realize that I was not the guy to do every aspect of the executive function. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we brought on a guy named Marty Sunday, who's our president right now. And really, a lot of the cultural improvements have happened since he got here. And he does focus on culture, but mostly what he's focused on was just making sure that everybody knows how to do their jobs, that there's absolute role clarity, that everyone knows how they're going to be evaluated on their job, what's going to determine their raise, what's going to determine whether or not they get fired, and creating that operational infrastructure that feels very crisp and creates a sense of safety in the eyes of the employee because they know how the world works. And if you get the both sides right, if you get kind of the operational stuff so the employee knows how to do their job, that's the kind of the table stakes that we were missing, and you combine it with a really passionate culture and you have executives that are living those values, the consequences, today we've got a 57% net promoter score and a 4.8 on Glassdoor. I mean, it really makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in the words you just shared there. And I think that it starts in your heart. I know that people who are listening to this can tell what kind of person you are. Obviously, the title of this is For You Leaders, and it really does start in the heart of the leader. And you're somebody that desperately cares. Like I said, when you left, you were hurt that those values weren't keeping going, and you figured out a different way to do it. Same thing when you rented out the entire Hilton, and it looked at first like it was going to be a success, and you had to step back and reevaluate. There's definitely a theme here about you dream big and you're willing to kind of step back and evaluate. So that's really big.
Yeah, I think that actually came from one of the greatest gifts that my path towards executive is so weird. I mean, I'm 37 years old. I've been employed now since I was 21, and since I was 22, I've been a CEO. So I don't have a lot of experience other than just this one job. And when I started off at 22, I honestly had no idea what I was doing. And when you're in that situation, you really have absolutely no choice. I mean, I read a lot of books as fast as I could, and I tried to get my MBA at Vanderbilt, and I was filling my gaps as fast as I could. But day to day, the only way to survive was to trust the employees. One of the things that I would say all the time is the best idea will be the most buoyant one. My job is to help make sure it floats to the top. And try to get everybody else engaged and feeding in ideas. And I think what that created for me was, if you'd have known me in college, I was probably a little more arrogant than I am now, I hope. And
Weren't we all?
Probably. And I just think like having to admit that you don't know what you're doing in front of people that see you as their boss, and having to say, I have to depend on you guys to help me make decisions, forced an egalitarian culture. And I wouldn't have gone that direction if I'd have been more confident. But what I learned from my experience at Dealerskins was that it creates such an incredible sense of engagement when everybody believes, because it's true, that they're a part of the strategy, that they're engaged in making decisions with the business. Suddenly people that are on the front lines that would normally just be, kind of thinking of their job as, here I come to turn the crank, start to think about what really makes this company different. How do we win better? Is there a little angle that I can see and go tell Gabe about? And having that engagement, which I believe we absolutely have here at Kasasa today, is a big, big part of our success. And again, it wasn't anything I engineered. I got lucky and didn't know what I was doing. And that lesson got taught to me by chance.
Yeah, well, luck may have had a part in it. I think it's just kind of how you're hardwired, and it has to do with probably the people that you've surrounded yourself growing up, influences like your parents and other people like that. But at the core of that, what happened was, because you and I have both seen people that are lean on everyone and that are just kind of needy and just kind of you just kind of feel nervous being around them. And then you've seen people like yourself that lean on other people, that it inspires them and makes them feel part of something and encourages them. And at the core of that, I think it's because they trust you. They trust your intentions. They trust the words that come out of your mouth. They trust your motives. And that, it becomes a strength when you say, hey, I can't do this for myself. Everyone says, well, heck yeah, I want to make sure Gabe and the organization is where they need to be. It's a subtle but significant difference I see play out all the time.
Yeah, that's cool.
So I think the answer is in the middle of some of the things that you said, but I'd like to be explicit about it. As the organization has grown, how have you made sure that the culture grows with the organization?
That's incredibly difficult, and it feels like waves. Like, it was so easy up to 50 people, then we got to 100, and it was like all of a sudden what I used to do didn't work. And then, we try a few new tactics, and then we get to 200 people, and then that doesn't work anymore. And I don't know that the way that we're doing it is the right way, but the way that we've tried to approach this is just like cover every single base that there could possibly be. We wrote out our values in a 40-page book that absolutely says what they stand for. There's a test on it that you have to take, and if you don't pass, you get a few tries, but if you don't pass, you don't keep your job. We do War College, which is an onboarding program for new employees, where we spend the whole day going through these patch values. I talk about the patch at virtually every all hands meeting. And I just think that what it is consistent repetition through a variety of touch points, and also being willing to fire people that don't adhere and to hire people that do. I mean, the thing about culture that I've really learned, and this is another one that's like one of those pride prickers. I think if I were to go back to my earlier years as a CEO, I kind of believed that I had enough charisma and persuasion that I could talk you into feeling a way about the company or the values that we stand for. And I've come to realize that, it's a quote that I heard sometime, like you can't put into a person what their parents didn't. It's really hard to get a person to choose to feel a way. Because think about values, it is a choice. It's like, I can make you do your job or fire you, but I can't make you feel it. And so it's just so much easier to hire people that naturally feel that way and then fire the ones that don't, and then have constant reinforcement so nobody forgets about what we stand for. And that just requires lots of repetition and always being on message. And when you screw up, acknowledging it immediately.
That's great. Thank you. Real quickly, can you tell me the 4 values?
Sure.
Just the words.
It's interdependence, which is basically about teamwork. And actually, these values, let me back up for a second. The way the values are structured is kind of neat. They're all in internal conflict with each other, and it's designed to create a balance in the way that the employee behaves, because there's rarely one type of behavior that's always right. You have to kind of think about what's the right way to respond to different situations. So one of the values is interdependence, which is about getting team results. We have another value that's about 5-star leadership, which is about thinking of yourself always as a 5-star general that's accountable for results and authorized to challenge anything and anyone in their way. If you just think about those 2 values, if you were one or the other only, you would be ineffective, because if you only cared about your team results, you would, be a servant to the team, but you might not get your job done. If you only thought about your job, then you might not be a helper to the team, and then the company suffers. So those 2 kind of balance each other. And then the other 2 values are more of emotions. One of them is love, which stands for love the company, love your coworkers, and love our clients. Yep. And kind of balancing that one off is one that I would have called excellence, but John Wapsh, who's our Chief Innovation Officer, said, everybody calls it excellence. What I really hear is you just want to work with a bunch of badasses that play to win every day. I said, exactly. He said, why don't you call it Badassitude, which I can't believe we do, but we do have a value called Badassitude, which basically means that there should be a palpable sense of intensity in the way that we do our jobs, and we shouldn't bring a product to market unless we believe that it is unique in some way that really differentiates it. And so you've got interdependence with 5-star leadership balanced, and then you have love and badassitude kind of balancing each other's on the emotional spectrum. And I think that, as employees think about those values, there's different times to apply each one depending on when the situation calls for it.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, you guys have a conference room named Badassitude. I remember having a meeting in that. I was like,
we've got a conference room for every value, and then we have a whole bunch of conference rooms that are named after Greek battles, because we use the Spartan helmet to represent the idea of interdependence, because the Spartans fought in a phalanx that was inherently interdependent.
Yeah. Well, Gabe, I know you need to get running. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Tell people listening where they can go find out a little bit more about Kasasa and a little bit more about you, Twitter handle or any things like that.
Kasasa is www.kasasa.com, KASASA.com, and Twitter handle is GM Krajicek.
Well, thank you very much, Gabe. Got a ton out of this. We're going to do this again soon. I still have a lot more questions that I want to ask you, but I really do appreciate your insight, and I know people got a ton out of today, so thank you. I hope you really enjoyed today's podcast with Gabe. I wish I would have had some more time. There's a lot more questions I want to ask him. In fact, this won't be the last time you hear from Gabe. We'll have him on again for sure. I want to make sure that you subscribe to For You Leaders podcast. You can do that. You can subscribe at foryouleaders.com. Once again, please just subscribe at foryouleaders.com and make sure that you don't miss any future podcasts. We've got some exciting guests coming on, CEO of a publicly traded company, someone that is part of a higher educational institution. These are all really exciting thought leaders in their industry and are going to provide great insights. What'd you learn from today? Ask yourself, how have you made sure that your culture grows with the company? It's kind of a unique thing to think about. Oftentimes we think we set in values and we set in culture and it stays stagnant, but it grows like the organization grows, or at least it needs to. So how have you thought about doing that? Also, how will you know that your culture lives beyond you, that is bigger than you, lives outside of you, that it isn't dependent upon you being there? You heard Gabe talk about that, and it was one of the realizations he had coming into Bankview and now Kasasa. Think about how you're operationalizing the values, how you're getting it down from a 30,000-foot kind of concept down to the ground level where people can really attach to it. It can be part of your processes, how you hire, how you promote, and the values that you really care about. It really is one of the ways, maybe one of the key ways, of how Kasasa is not only taking on the Goliaths of their industry, but they're winning. I want to know, what did you think of this episode today? Gabe, no doubt, is a very insightful, very smart guy. Chip and I want to know what you thought of the episode. More importantly, we want to know what you think of these podcasts. Good or bad, would you please go to iTunes, leave a review for us, and we will take that very seriously and incorporate it into future podcasts. I hope you enjoyed today's For You Leaders podcast. Have a great day.